Hello, welcome to the Malibu Music Room. Hey, I wonder who that could be. Why, it's Gered Mankowitz.
Hey, John, how are you?
In from London.
Wow, great to
He
be
must
here.
be tired after that flight.
Oh my God, it's such a long journey.
Hello, welcome to the Malibu Music Room. And very excited to have Gered Mankowitz with us. Been wanting him to be here for a long time, but hard to get him to fly into town. So very good to have you here, Gered.
Great to be here,
Good
John.
to see you, man.
Lovely to be
Yeah.
here. Thank you.
So, obviously an iconic career. There was a little blurb in the opening that kind of gave us a setup. But just to dive right into it, I'd like to just get into getting your career started. I mean, I think it's a very interesting story with Peter. Your first interaction with a Hasselblad camera.
Yeah, well, yes. Peter Sellers, the great comedian and actor,
right.
was an avid amateur photographer. And my father worked with him, and he came to Sunday lunch at our house. He brought with him a full Hasselblad kit and a Polaroid camera, big format, 4x5-inch Polaroid. And he started taking photographs of me and my brother so that my brother appeared to be in my hand, in the palm of my hand.
Right.
He'd just been working on Tom Thumb.
Yeah.
And I guess that was the inspiration for it, which it was magical to see these pictures suddenly appear, and
Right.
I was enthralled. And then he started telling me and showing me the Hasselblad, how it worked, and allowing me to hold it and see the interchangeable lenses and everything. But he did it in a mad Swedish chef type voice. And I was weeping with laughter, really. And I just related this extraordinary piece of equipment with laughter and happiness. It was just a feeling. And so after he left, I said to my dad, I want a Hasselblad. I want to be a photographer.
Right. And roughly what year was that?
50, 57.
would you say you would
I was 11, I think.
Yeah.
57.
And so really from that time on, you decided that that's what you wanted to do? I mean, that clicked with you?
Yes, it clicked, and I think I was searching for something. I wasn't particularly academic at school. There was always a certain amount of pressure that I wasn't particularly bright at school. So I was looking for something else.
But your father, of course, a well-known screenwriter, playwright, and your mother, famous Jungian psychotherapist.
Indeed.
But neither of those things really.
No, but also there was a lot of pressure from Dad. English was so important to him. I was a very late reader because I was probably dyslexic, only nobody knew what that was.
Right.
So there was generally a sort of feeling that I was just a bit thick and I wasn't going to go on to further education.
Right.
And the chances are that I wasn't going to pass any sort of exam. So there was a general feeling that I was going to do something. I always wanted to be in the theatre, but I was discouraged to be an actor.
Right.
I wanted to design for the theatre, which I did a bit of at school, and I thought that was really lovely. I loved the theatre through going backstage with my dad, going to rehearsals, which I remember doing from a very early age. I had a fantastic dressing up kit at home. I had a full makeup kit. So I would appear in whiskers and as a very old man. And, when I was sort of 8 or 9,
Fantastic.
I would make these family appearances. So that was always in my blood.
Right.
But when the Hasselblad came into my life, and Sellers just made it so entrancing and exciting, that I thought, this is it. And then my grandmother, wanting to encourage me, bought me a little camera called a Bensini Comet, which was a tiny little thing, 127 format, that's smaller than 120 and bigger than 35mm. And I started taking pictures, and I went on a school holiday to Delft in Holland. I photographed the cathedral When I got home and they were processed, my father looked at them and he thought, you know, these are rather good. I'm going to show them to this old friend of mine, a photographer called Tom Blau. And Tom Blau very sweetly and very generously offered me an apprenticeship.
Wow.
And that was, he sort of basically said, if you want to pursue photography and when you leave school, come and see me. And that's what I did.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And then did you go to Bermuda shortly after that? Where did
That was Barbados. Well, what
Barbados.
happened was I went to serve an apprenticeship. So Tom Blau had a company in London called Camera Press, who were a syndication agency. They represented hundreds and hundreds of photographers, many very, very major photographers. Arnold Newman was one of theirs, Karshav Otter was one of theirs, and many others. And he offered me an apprenticeship, which I did, and I worked there for about 6 months. And for some unknown reason, I won't go into it because it's unclear, but my father decided to take the family to Barbados in the West Indies.
Right.
And I was considered to be too young to stay in London and pursue my career. So I went with the family, and the idea was that I would start taking photographs. I mean, this is pretty extraordinary stuff, but my father's thinking was that, you know, if I'm going to support him through 3 or 4
Right.
years of education, where's that going to go? I might as well support him in his efforts to be a photographer.
Well, thank
And that's
God
what
he
I
was
did.
that had that mindset
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah.
You know. So when did you transition into music photography?
When I left, so cut then to, I went to Barbados. I started a photographic career there in a very limited way,
Yeah.
but I learned a lot, learned a huge amount. Ran my own darkroom, shot for local papers. I did a lot of stuff. Then I came back, the whole family came back, and I got a job with a showbiz photographer called Jeff Vickers, who remains a sort of big figure in my life. And Jeff was shooting front of house for theatre, and I had shot a show called Fiorello, which was an American musical
Right,
about
right, right.
Fiorello LaGuardia.
Yeah.
And I'd shot that in Bristol, at the Bristol Old Vic.
Okay.
And they loved my pictures, and they used them as the front of house pictures
Oh.
for that. So that was where I
Unusual.
was heading.
Unusual at the
Yeah,
time.
very unusual. And so that's where I was heading. I was going to be a theatrical photographer, and that seemed fine to me. When I was with Jeff, he did a lot of portraits of actors, 10/8 glosses,
Sure.
press pictures.
Headshots.
Yeah, headshots, that's right. And quite a lot of the younger actors who were still students really couldn't afford him. So he gave them to me.
Wow.
And 2 of them were Chad Stewart and Jeremy Clyde. They were young actors, Central School of Speech and Drama in London. And they came to me, I photographed them. They said, hey, we sing together. We're a duo, Chad and Jeremy. We sing in
Right.
a coffee shop in Mayfair, come and photograph us, which is what I did. They were then signed, they were discovered and signed by John Barry to Ember Records, which was an independent label. They liked my work with Chad and Jeremy, and they started using my pictures for Chad and Jeremy, but they also used me for other artists. So one of the first artists I photographed for them was Annie Ross, who was a great jazz singer with Lambert, Hendrix, and Ross. And that was it. Suddenly I had transitioned from being a showbiz photographer to being a music photographer.
Interesting.
And it felt absolutely right. It was part of showbiz, but it was populated by a lot of young people, a lot of energy, and a lot of room to perhaps expand and do different sort of work.
Well, let's just back up a little bit here with John Barry.
Okay.
For my audience, just in case, just to explain a little bit who
Of
John
course.
Barry is.
Of course. So John Barry was a composer arranger, I think that's the way
Yeah.
to sum him up. And a producer as well, actually. And he had produced a recording artist called Adam Faith. He'd also produced some music singles, jingles.
Right.
And one of them was for a very famous English TV show called Jukebox Jury. And his signature sound was a sort of plucking violin.
Ah.
That was his signature sound, if you like. And so the theme from Jukebox Jury was a big success. Adam Faith had some hits. And John Barry was a successful pop producer, arranger, composer. And he formed a band called the John Barry Seven to perform these themes and other things that had become successful independently. So to go out on the road and to be an act. He wasn't in it, but it carried his name.
Right.
And he, I guess, ran it. I don't know. So I photographed the John Barry 7 for John.
Yeah.
John found and produced Chad and Jeremy for Ember Records, and a friendship was formed.
And again, just for my audience, just to mention about John Barry's association with 007 franchise, arranging the music for all that.
Yes.
As well, that's really in America how we be best known.
Yes, absolutely. So he arranged all of that. He did all the incidental music. He wrote the score.
Right.
He didn't write dang 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 dang
Right.
dang dang. He didn't write that. A guy called Monty Norman wrote that. But John arranged it, I guess. Yeah.
Another quick aside, so people put context of Jukebox Jury, how important that show was.
Yes.
Jane Asher, of course, was one of the judges on Jukebox Jury, and that's how she met Paul McCartney when the Beatles were on Jukebox Jury. So all these things relate to this burgeoning history that, the theme kind of here is that nobody had any idea what was about to happen. There was no roadmap for rock and roll at that time period.
None at all.
So the next big steps now, Jeremy to Marianne.
Yes. Well, here's the extraordinary thing. Chad and Jeremy had singles, promotions. They were quite successful in a small way in the UK. They were much bigger here in America.
Huge here.
Huge here for quite a long while. But they went to do another show, another important cerebral TV show called Thank Your Lucky Stars. Thank Your Lucky Stars was recorded in Birmingham.
Right.
And Chad and Jeremy went to do that. And on the same show was Marianne doing her first television promotion of As Tears Go By.
And Marianne Faithfull was just for our
Yes,
audience.
I'm sorry, for Marianne Faithfull. So Marianne was nervous, apprehensive, and unaccompanied. She'd just been sent. And Jeremy befriended her. As
he's
he
wont
would.
to do.
and she came back to London with them on the train. I was meeting them at their apartment, and we were all going to go and have dinner.
Right.
And there was Marianne, and beautiful and sweet and funny and lovely, and I just thought she was absolutely gorgeous. And I asked if I could photograph her, and she agreed. And I whisked her off to one of my favourite locations, which was Barnes Common, not far from where Olympic Studios was going to be, and started photographing her, and remained a friend to this day.
Yeah, fantastic. So, from Marianne.
Well, Marianne was managed by Andrew Loog Oldham,
Yeah.
who I didn't meet when I was first photographing Marianne because he wasn't involved in the day-to-day management.
Right.
There was somebody else who worked for him was. But he saw my pictures and he really liked a picture I did of Marianne in the Salisbury pub in St Martin's Lane in the central London, which was a lovely picture, which was part of a series that was for her album cover.
Yeah.
And I was contacted, said Andrew, wants to meet you and talk to you about photographing his other band, the Rolling Stones.
Right.
And that's how I got to work with the Stones.
I think it's important to mention here that Andrew is quite an iconic character and a friend to our show, luckily. First of all, he's your age. He's not like the typical manager. He's your age.
Yeah.
Maybe he might even be a bit
Little older.
yeah.
Yeah, a year or two older.
Yeah, but
than me,
basically
still,
not 20 years older like most managers.
No,
would
we were
be.
all sort of pretty much teenagers.
Yeah. And he was the producer as well as the manager.
Yeah.
I mean, in that sense, he was Brian Epstein and George Martin. In terms of the position he played with the Rolling Stones. So he's really an important person in rock and roll for you to meet up with.
Yeah.
I just want to go back a little bit to Chad and Jeremy.
Oh, okay.
Because I want to show that kind of iconic photograph, really. And might mention a little bit the one with the wall, relieving on the wall.
Okay.
Because I always wanted to ask you this. Well, first talk about that. And then my question with that is, do you think The Who stole that idea for Who's Next?
Okay. Well, in my first session with Chad and Jeremy, we shot in a location that we all knew, but they knew particularly well because it was actually an adjacent lot to the Central School of Speech and Drama.
Oh.
Now, the Central School of Speech and Drama was situated in an old theatre called the Embassy Theatre at Swiss Cottage, which is North London.
Yes. St. James Wood.
Yes,
Yeah.
St. James Wood, Swiss Cottage, yeah, absolutely, same area. And it's such a small world. During the early 50s, my father and a partner leased the Embassy Theatre and put on productions there.
Wow.
And that's where I would go with him on a Saturday afternoon, watch rehearsals, get makeup from the actors, hang out, generally get a feeling. So that was part of my childhood as well. And these guys, Chad and Jeremy, were at acting school there. And beside it was what was actually a bomb site, which London was littered with these lots that were old buildings that had been smashed in the war and hadn't been recovered. So it was like a sort of adventure playground of old brick and rooms with no windows.
But live munition too.
Yeah. Well, I guess there was the odd unexploded bomb.
Right.
Yeah. But and they knew about it, and we went there. And amongst other things was this urinal, this stand-up urinal with the cistern on the wall and everything.
Right.
That I assume must have been indoors once, but was now outdoors. And with sort of, youthful rebelliousness, we did a funny picture where they've got the guitars on their backs and they appear to be peeing against the wall and leaning over, looking at me as though,
But very odd for Chad and Jeremy, the most milquetoast of non-rebellion music.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. But, they were sharp guys, and and we thought it was a funny picture. We didn't think it was remotely offensive. I mean, we didn't cross our mind. We just thought it was fun, and it was. But the record company rejected it. It was sort of considered to be.
But do you think the Who stole the?
I really have no idea. I think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely because I'm not even sure whether the Chad and Jeremy pissing against the wall picture, as we call it, I'm not sure whether that was ever seen contemporaneously. I don't think it was seen.
So now you've met Andrew, Lou Goldham, through Marianne Faithfull. And what happened next?
Well, Andrew was a tremendous force. He was fantastically he had amazing energy. And chutzpah and vision, fantastic vision, and he just felt that I might bring something to the photographic table, the image of the Stones, that was grittier and rougher round the edges than the incredible stuff that David Bailey had been shooting just prior to my session. So he'd gone to David Bailey, shot... Who,
for my audience, was the premier fashion photographer, really.
Indeed.
In Britain at the time.
Indeed. And very much a mover and shaker in that whole world.
If you think of the thing I think of is like Shampoo, the movie for Los Angeles, he was kind of like that. In other words, he also dated all the beautiful actresses and everything else.
Married several of them. And he was a great photographer. I mean, he was an excellent photographer. And Blow Up is based on him. And the film Blow Up is based. So he was, but he was older than me, and he was much more skilled than me. And he brought a sort of a glamorous gloss to everything that he did. And I think, and the pictures were great. They were used on covers. And I think Andrew felt that there needed to be something a bit cruder, a bit coarser, a bit grittier. And felt that I might bring that to the table. And I did a shoot with them early in '65, and they were wonderful to work with. I mean, they really were terrific, very cooperative, very supportive. I guess I represented no threat, so they were very comfortable around me. I had a lovely studio even
then. Also,
then.
you were the same age, which was something that wasn't normal at that time.
That's right. I was even a little younger than them. And another great photographer of the period who worked a lot with the Stones was Terry O'Neill, but he was 7 years older than me as well. So I was a teenager, and in that sense, I think they felt comfortable. They seemed very happy to have me around. But I did produce results. I mean, the thing is that doors may open for you, but you have to make that work. You have to step up. And I did that. And I'd realized by this time that if you were going to get your work on a cover, you had to shoot create pictures that would work on a cover, because nothing was conceptual. Sleeves weren't planned. They weren't conceived in a sense. Yeah. They were made from pictures that the agent, the manager had, or the record company had, that lent themselves to a period, which means that you had to have room for the logo, room for the text, blah, blah, blah. If possible, the faces of the band had to be towards the top for racking and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I realized the logo went in the corner on the top.
Yeah. And so I knew that, I'd realized that. So I shot everything I could, because I was shooting on the Hasselblad, square format, 6x6 format.
Perfect for an album cover.
Perfect for an album cover. I could compose with an album cover in mind, which is what I did. Everything I shot, I thought, this could be a cover, this could be a cover. I didn't know, but that was the idea. So when Andrew got all the material, he seemed to see the same things, and he found a cover. And I got what I think was Out of Our Heads in England and December's Children Here.
Yes, correct.
And that was my first cover.
When did you set up your studio in Mason's Yard?
Very early. I set up my studio in '63.
Really?
Very early.
And for our audience, Mason's Yard itself is an iconic place because of the Scotch and Indica, Bag of Nails.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just go into a little bit about those places and where they are in rock history.
Absolutely.
And I believe was John married to Marianne at that time?
He was.
Okay.
No, he was. But actually, my studio, of those three things, of Scotch of St. James, which was a discotheque club, and Indica, which was this art gallery bookshop, both actually came just after my gallery. When I went into Mason's Yard, it was basically full of car parks, multi-level, old-fashioned multi-level car parks, plus a couple of art restorers and nothing else really.
Yeah.
And we found it by accident. My father and I were just walking around the back of Piccadilly, and we found it. And the guy, Jeff Vickers, who I had worked for, who had mentored me, was the show business photographer. He was being thrown out of his studio, which was in Hanover Square, opposite Vogue magazine, because the building was being redeveloped. He didn't have enough money for a deposit on a new place. My father and I found this. My father paid the deposit, and Jeff and I moved in together. Me still working for Jeff, but also shooting independently. And we shared the studio, not for very long, because Jeff's career sort of took off. And after about 7 or 8 months, he outgrew Mason's Yard, and I pretty much took it over myself.
Right. But I wanted my audience to know that you were there, and what Mason's Yard kind of became the hub of, the cool music life for a while, with the maybe just a quick word on Indica and Scotch of St. James and stuff, so people get some connection.
Absolutely.
Because it's going to come back again with Hendrix.
Well, the Scotch of St. James, I think, opened around about 65.
Right.
And Indica opened, I think, round about 66 or 67. So the Scotch of St. James was this very cool discotheque at a time when there were probably a dozen clubs across London where everybody went.
Right.
And in the West End, the central part of London, there was about 4 or 5. There was the Crazy Elephant, Ad Lib, which was my personal favourite.
Right.
But the Scotch was very cool, much liked by musos. A lot of people went there. It was a cool place to be.
Yeah, and a lot of the bands, my understanding was kind of had their own little tables and things there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was very musician friendly.
Right.
Yeah, and they had live music, and people would busk and stand in and jam and all of that.
Yeah.
And then Indica was a bookshop gallery that was owned by John Dunbar, who was Marianne Faithfull's husband at this point, with Barry Miles, who was, I don't know how you describe him. He was a writer. He
went on to really write the Paul McCartney authoritative autobiography, but he was friends with Paul through that.
He was friends with Paul, and I think the Beatles put up a certain amount of funding, and Peter Asher was involved.
Yeah.
And it was an experimental art gallery and bookshop, And it was also where Yoko Ono had her first London show and where John Lennon met her and fell in love with her.
But I believe it also played into the Beatles story as well, because it was a place for the Beatles guys from Liverpool to kind of get immersed in the London culture of literature and things like that too, you know.
I think it probably was. I think it, but it wasn't. I'm not sure whether at the time one was actually aware of that, because that was just how it was.
Right.
You know,
but
I think
you just happened to stumble into your studio, ended up being the nidus of the hub of what really was going to be swinging London.
Absolutely,
really.
It was one of the central points of swinging.
Of course, you were driving your Rolls Royce at that time.
Yes, and I had a garage, so I used to park my Rolls Royce underneath the studio.
So that was a little side there. Now let's get back. You've met Andrew.
Yeah.
You're shooting the Stones.
Yeah.
You've done Out of Our Heads.
Yeah.
And then the tour.
And then Andrew asked me, would I be able to go to America with them for the fall 1965 fall tour, which began in October.
Again, Satisfaction came out around May or June of '65. So this is the huge Rolling Stones tour. The previous tours had been okay, but not wildly successful. But now they're going to America on the heels of Satisfaction.
Absolutely, and the single was "Get Off My Cloud."
Yeah.
So which is, I guess, the follow-up to Satisfaction. So Satisfaction had been this enormous global hit and had put the Stones right up there with the Beatles. And this was a consolidating tour. I think it was quite a big tour. I think something like 48 shows in 40 cities, something like that. And I mean, I wouldn't have missed that for the world. What a treat. But to try and get some perspective on it, on the plane, Andrew was already in New York with Alan Klein. On the plane, it was just me, the band, and Ian Stewart.
Right.
There was no team. There was no paraphernalia. Right. It was just us.
No entourage.
No entourage. I was one of the gang. I was one of the band. I was treated like one of the band. Yeah. There was no separation. There was no question of access or no access. There were no passes. There was none of that stuff.
Yeah.
And it was fantastic. I mean, I got it all. I was sitting in the limo, which was being crushed by the crowds that wouldn't let the car into the hotel. I mean, it was fantastic. And I wasn't really equipped to record it as comprehensively as maybe I should. But I had a great time and I learned a huge amount. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Well, let's back up a little bit again, because I'd like to talk a little bit about Brian and Ian Stewart.
Okay.
Because really the Rolling Stones initially were Brian and Ian Stewart.
Yeah.
And the other guys came in.
Yeah.
Ian Stewart has kind of been lost to history. But he was a central figure in the beginning of the Rolling Stones when they were a blues band. Fantastic keyboardist. And you might say a little bit more about him.
Well, Stu was, obviously, by the time I came on the scene, I met the band in '64. But they weren't able to do a session with me until '65. Stu was the roadie. All this, he'd been thrown out of the group or asked to leave the group, however you interpret it.
But really, not because of musical reasons.
No, because he was a brilliant piano player.
And continued, really, my understanding is continued playing off stage.
Yes, and he played on a lot of the singles when they needed a pianist. That's Stu, and he was wonderful. And he wasn't, although he didn't look the part, he was a great looking, very handsome as a young man. There's a wonderful book called Stu, which is a marvelous, comprehensive, in-depth history of him. And some of the early portraits of him, he's a handsome guy.
Yeah.
But he just didn't fit the image. He wasn't this sort of skinny wastrel that Keith and Mick and Brian.
And Andrew was into image.
Andrew was into image, and I think Andrew was absolutely certain that a six-piece band wouldn't make it. It's not a commercial.
Yeah, I kind of feel that same way.
Yeah,
it's got to be 4 or 5. At 6 pieces, it becomes a review, not a rock and roll band.
Absolutely. And Andrew felt that, but Stu appeared to be quite happy about it.
It's amazing he would do that. I mean, it's just the personality I think needs to be what a personality that he had, that he was willing to just to stay with everybody. He was willing to become the roadie when he was really one of the founders and is a great pianist.
And I think he remained for the sort of conscience, the musical conscience of the band.
Right.
I mean, he'd get pretty incensed if they messed up on stage.
Yeah.
He got very angry with Brian, who
Right.
I think was often, you know, if Brian felt the audience was making so much noise they didn't really hear what was
Right.
playing, Brian would just play, you know, the Popeye the Sailor Man
Right,
tune
right.
in the middle of
Right.
Satisfaction or something.
right.
Stu didn't like that.
Yeah.
So Stu would, you know, tell them off.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Stu did not suffer fools gladly. He was not remotely inhibited. He was very upfront, very in your face. If he didn't like you, you knew it. And he was tough, and he was
Yeah.
hard, and he was the roadie. I mean, there wasn't anybody else
Yeah,
helping.
right.
He lugged all the equipment.
Like Mal.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah,
amazing.
absolutely.
Well, again, we'll talk a little bit about Brian Jones because he's, you know, known more than Stewart is, but I don't think people realize that he really was a blues aficionado and really the leader of the band initially. And I'm just wondering your observations about when he stopped being the leader and when Mick and Keith came forward and when his decline, if you talk about that a little bit too, which I think your photographs really show that, especially the Primrose Hill ones.
Yes. Well, that's interesting you should say that, because I think that in the first session in early 65, I think you don't necessarily think of Brian as the leader of the band, but you do see him very predominant in the photographs. And I think that at that particular moment, early in 65, his image, his look, was probably the most evolved of all of them. I think his charisma was showing, whereas the others, perhaps it was...
He kind of defined what a rock star looked like in terms of dress and look and everything else.
When he had that extraordinary hair,
Yeah.
which was pretty much unlike anyone else in the business at that time. He had the look, you know, he was narrow-hipped, and he wasn't tall, Brian, but he was very narrow-hipped. He had quite a big head. He sort of quite wide shoulders and this funny, tiny little, you know, that was a look. That was the way pop stars needed to be.
Yeah, but he was setting that, nobody knew that ahead of time.
No, not really.
That's not the way Elvis was.
No, definitely not. No, definitely not. And he was pretty confident, and as far as I could tell, he was capable of tremendous charm.
Yes.
And yes, he was the founder of the band, and he adopted the role of the leader. This was before my time, but I think the rot started to set in because he did take more money than the others as the leader, and I'm not sure whether that was fully appreciated. Yeah. But then by the end of 65, I think for him, the real crunch was the fact that Mick and Keith were writing.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure when that started. I think late 64.
I believe that was Andrew's doing.
That was Andrew. Well, Andrew, you see, Andrew had the vision to know that they weren't going to move on if they were going to do covers.
Right.
I mean, they were doing R&B covers.
Right, B-sides.
Yeah. So they needed to write their own material. And they didn't know they had it in them. Mm-hmm. And Andrew basically put them in a position where they had to find it. Yeah. And they did. And Brian didn't write.
Right.
You know, I mean, he tried perhaps, but he didn't. He didn't have that particular skill set. So the Stones were beginning to emerge as Mick and Keith's band because Mick and Keith were writing the material, and that was difficult for Brian to deal with.
Brian was one of those people who could get music out of any instrument. It didn't. I mean, even if he really no matter what the craziest instruments. I mean, I remember reading about them in Morocco. And just picking up stuff, and he could make things, and that really added texture to a lot of these recordings that people don't realize that he's playing all these crazy instruments on these things.
That's right, and the recorder, and no, he did, and he was capable of doing that, and he was incredibly talented, clearly, enormously talented, but I think that it was difficult for him as the band moved into making their own music. I think that must have been difficult for him. Yeah. I mean, I'm only an observer. You know, I was around,
But you were there.
I was there, but I think part of the problem was that Brian seemed to take more drugs, drink more alcohol, be more erratic than the others, than anyone else that I'd ever come across. And that made him unreliable. Even by the end of 65, on that tour, he was showing these weird mood changes. He would suddenly disappear, or, you know, he just wouldn't make a show. It was announced that he had flu or something and couldn't perform, and they'd perform as a four-piece, you know. And I didn't know what that was all about. And I'm not sure whether anyone really understood what was going on. I mean, but it became worse. So there were good days, there were bad days, and it then just began to get worse and worse. And by the time I was shooting with them at the end of 66, when I was doing what was going to be Between the Buttons, he was increasingly difficult to work with, increasingly unreliable. And during that session, which was early in the morning after an all-night recording session, I'd suggested that we did a shoot because I felt the band looked fantastic, haggard and worn out and hungover and stoned, and they looked like the Rolling Stones should look. And I took them up to the top of Primrose Hill, which is part of a Regent's Park in North London, to try and catch the early morning light. And Brian had a big fur coat on, huge collar, bought a newspaper, was burying his head in the newspaper, hiding behind the collar, turning his back to the camera, looking away. And I was worried that he was messing up the pictures. And I turned and I said to Andrew, as discreetly as I could, I said, I'm worried about Brian. You know, I'm really worried that he's screwing up the session. And Andrew said to me, you don't have to give it a second thought, because anything that Brian does at this stage will only enhance the image of the Stones, which was fantastic vision of him. And it reassured me. I let go of worrying about that and freed me, absolutely. And we got maybe another 10 or 15 minutes and we got some great material. And I hoped and prayed that we'd got the cover. And Andrew saw it straight away. And it was Andrew's genius to put the type in tiny, tiny, tiny little text in the buttons on Charlie's jacket. And Between the Buttons was such a sort of controversial title. So it was good.
In the days before zippers.
Yes, absolutely. The day before zippers.
The thing about that shot, I'd like you to go into that a little bit about your technique, but also, I feel that Brian looks like a ghost in those pictures, like he's already gone.
Do you think that's just with hindsight?
That's all I have.
Yeah, of course you do. I don't know. I felt that once I was free to not worry about him, I think actually his presence is very powerful. He doesn't care. He doesn't look as though he cares. And I think that you can interpret that as being very much in the spirit of the Rolling Stones, really. It was me who was being conservative by worrying about him not looking into the camera, if you like. But maybe he was continuing to embody a sort of rebellious spirit of the band by not giving a shit. But looking back now, maybe there is a slightly not all there presence to him.
Yeah, it's almost like a prescient thing about the photo. But
I took a photograph back in 65 in the recording studio when the band were recording at RCA Studios in Hollywood. I took a photograph that seemed to, not consciously, I took a 35mm photograph of all 5 of them standing at the desk, but Brian's sitting. And they are all looking at Brian. And they're standing up and Brian is sitting down. It's almost as though Brian is disappearing. And Stu is in the picture, but only half of him. And it's a strange picture because it sort of foretells what's happening. Stu's half out of the band, but half in. The guys are all looking at Brian. Brian's looking rather vacant and is shrinking
Yeah.
Wow, it's a strange picture.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. So mention a little bit about your technique at Primrose Hill. They got that blurred effect.
Yes. Well, prior to this, album sleeve photography was still not conceptual. You know, we wouldn't plan a shoot for a cover.
Right.
You might have a cover in mind, but it wasn't conceived with a designer, art director. It was just what happened between you and the band. By this point in time, I'd felt confident in my relationship with the band and Andrew, crucially. But I also felt more confident in my own skills as a photographer, and I decided that I wanted to try and contribute something photographically to the image of the band. Beyond just trying to record it, I wanted to actually add something. And I wanted to add a sort of feeling, a stoned, trippy element to the picture. And so I got a piece of glass, I cut out a hole in black card to create a vignette, a slight falling off in the corners, put the glass in front of the lens, smeared that with Vaseline and shot through it.
Wow.
And the Vaseline, depending upon which way you smear it, you can do it in straight lines or in a circle, it takes everything, everything starts dissolving into everything else. It's just a beautiful blur. So their clothes, their faces start dissolving into the environment in what I thought, I'd never taken acid, so I had no idea what tripping was like. But I just thought that it had a feel, a visual feel that was appropriate to the time. And it worked really beautifully. And it didn't matter if, you know, Mick's face blurred into grayness. It really didn't matter. You knew it was the Rolling Stones.
It's really a transitional shot in rock and roll photography, you know, where you're now moving from straight ahead, clear photos to the psychedelic era is about to begin.
Yeah.
And so let's move on now to, so is the next era immediate with Andrew or?
Immediate was Immediate was formed, I think, in '65.
Yeah.
So Immediate was going on in the background.
Which is, for my audience, Andrew Lou Oldham's label.
Yes, Andrew. I think the first independent record label.
Yes.
Certainly one of the very early.
In the UK, for sure.
Yeah. And it was a fantastic place to be. And their first single was the McCoys' Hang On Sloopy, which went straight to #1. Right. So, you know, it was a great place to be. And it had some wonderful artists and marvelous writers and composers working there. And I wouldn't want to say I was the in-house photographer, but I contributed an awful lot of photography, shot a lot of the artists, particularly the Small Faces, Amen Corner, Vashti twice as much, P.P. Arnold. These were all artists I worked with a lot.
Right.
Duncan Brown. It was an exciting period.
Yeah.
So going into '67 with the Stones, I shot them when they did the London Palladium at the beginning of '67, and I was shooting the recording sessions for Satanic Majesties. And during these sessions, there was the bust up with Andrew. And it was very unpleasant, a horrible atmosphere, no fun to be there at all. The Stones brought in a new photographer called Michael Cooper. I didn't know who Michael Cooper was. I just knew that my days were numbered.
Right.
And that was it. I was out. Andrew was out. It must have been a bit distressing, but it wasn't any fun being around them anymore.
Right.
It just wasn't. And I felt much closer to Andrew than I did to the band by this time.
Right.
And so I, continued to work for Andrew at Immediate. I was working with a lot of other artists as well.
So just to go back a little bit, Gary, tell me about the Small Faces. Who is the lineup at that point in time?
I first photographed the Small Faces when somebody called Jimi Winston was still in the band. So it was very early on. And they were Steve Marriott, who was a fantastic singer, had a marvelous...
And guitarist, of course, as
and
well.
a great guitarist.
Humble Pie.
Yeah. Ronnie Lane, known as Plonk.
Right.
Jimi Winston was in the first band, and
Was Ian McLagan in it?
I can't remember. Ian McLagan replaced Jimi Winston.
Okay, what about Ronnie Wood?
No, Ronnie Wood wasn't anywhere in the picture.
And
that
Kenny
was the
Jones?
Faces.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So the Small Faces was Steve Marriott, Ronnie Lane, Ian McLagan, and Kenny Jones.
Yeah.
And they had incredible energy. They'd had 2 or 3 wonderful,
Fantastic live band.
marvelous live band, fantastic pop records. And then they came to immediate, quite a sort of complex manner, but they got there. And Andrew, I guess, with them wanted to make the ultimate album, and they created this album called Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, which was an extraordinary sort of production.
Well,
like
just
an
the
opera.
presentation of it really broke new ground in how albums were presented.
Yes.
Because you had this circular album that looked like a tobacco box,
Yes.
a tin.
Absolutely. So it was the, as far as I know, it was the first album ever to be in a round sleeve.
Right.
The sleeve opened up 4 times, so the front cover was a stylized artwork based on a tin of tobacco, smoking tobacco. Beautiful piece of artwork. Then when you opened it once, there was a photograph of the inside of a tin of tobacco and a specially made rolling papers that were called SUS, S-U-S. And then you opened it again, and there were 4 black and white portraits of the individual band members, which I took. And the concept behind that was that each of the portraits would have all 4 in them, but it would have a different one in the foreground, and 3 others would be in the background. And it was a great piece of music, great production, mad, completely mad, absolutely wonderful. And it was a marvelous project to be part of. But they also, they had some great hits, and during the time on Immediate. And it was, they were a very important band, great fun to work with. And
but in terms of production and presentation, this really broke new ground.
It did.
At a time with nothing like this ever happened before. An incredibly creative time where people really weren't thinking about budgets.
No.
It was like, what's cool?
Yeah.
It's interesting because we don't live in that world anymore.
No. And I think that it was probably only possible because of Andrew's creative vision and genius. I mean, it was not sound business. I mean, it was disastrous business.
Right.
I mean, but he just...
But it's art.
Yeah, I think it probably was. And it was a great piece of music. I mean, it's continuously re-released and repackaged and represented. It's part of British music history. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. And as a band, they were fantastic. But then they fell apart. Steve Marriott went on to form Humble Pie. Ronnie and the others became The Faces with Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood. And went on to extraordinary great things. And then Ronnie Lane went and did his own thing. I can't for the moment think of his own band, but it was it was a very fruitful
it was fantastic.
Extraordinary moment. Yeah.
So now Hendrix comes into the picture.
Into my picture, yeah. Well, Hendrix it was sort of discovered apparently by Chaz Chandler, who was the bass player in the Animals.
He made it happen.
Well, it was Chaz's vision, who he said to Hendrix, I want to take you to London. Hendrix had nothing to lose and said, yeah.
He was going nowhere in New York.
Nowhere
fast. He couldn't
fast.
get arrested in the United States.
Couldn't get arrested and as far as I understand, was passing the hat round after his performance.
I saw him at the Cafe Group.
Oh, okay.
So he was passing the hat around.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's ridiculous, So he came to London. Chaz brought him over and was going to produce him. And their first night, not that I was there, I have to say, but their first night in London, they pick him up from London Airport, bring him into town. He wants to go and play. They take him to the Scotch because that's where Chaz used to play.
Right.
Next door to my studio. I didn't know this. And it's blues night at the Scotch. And he just sits in and plays with the band, the house band.
Right.
Blew everybody away. And Chaz decided to do a series. I can't remember whether it was 2 or 3 little gigs at a club called the Bag of Nails in Kingley Street. It was parallel to Carnaby Street in London, Soho, and rang me and he said, I want you to photograph this guy, come over tonight, meet him, see him, hear him, whatever. And so I went to the Bag of Nails and I saw this insane looking guy playing music that it went over my head. I just didn't get it. What I could see was that he was brilliant. I didn't particularly like what he was playing. It was a bit cacophonous for me. You know, it was too sophisticated.
Well, feedback hadn't really been incorporated into the vernacular of music at that point.
That's right.
You know.
That's right, absolutely. But he was blowing it out. He was, whatever it is, kicking it out of the park. I mean, he was just...
He was a very physical player as well.
Yeah, teeth and head back but looked like nothing we'd ever seen. So I was just entranced by his image, clearly his charisma, and obviously he knew what he was doing. Didn't matter that I didn't really get it, but he knew what he was doing. And at the club that night, there was a legion of major British musical talent, all of whom were completely blown away. Wow. I briefly met him, very briefly, shook his hand, said hello, look forward to photographing you. Fantastic. Right. And then there was a gap, and I don't know why there was a gap. I think they sent him to Europe to work the band together.
Well, I'm sure Chaz put the band together at that point. Yeah. Because so, Noel Redding was supposed to replace Hilton Valentine as a guitarist in the Animals, and
he had to learn bass.
Yeah, he had to learn how to play the bass,
which is
why he plays bass like he's playing lead guitar.
Maybe. Right. And then there was Mitch Mitchell, this kid who was a jazz drummer, and it was a great combination.
It's an amazing combination in retrospect. I mean, that's why Chaz really had that vision of what would work best with Jimi. It's fantastic.
Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. And then he ended up by coming to my studio early in '67, and as far as I remember, I've tried to check this, but there's slightly conflicting reports. I don't think Hey Joe had been a hit, but I think it was out there and was showing signs of being a hit. Right. So as far as I'm concerned, Jimi hadn't made it yet. Yeah. It was very fresh and very new. And I, in my pretentious, precocious, made this fateful decision. I was absolutely adamant that I was only going to photograph him in black and white. Mm-hmm. I wanted to photograph him like Arnold Newman would have photographed a musician, or Karsh of Ottawa would have photographed. I wanted
Irving.
Irving Penn or Richard Avedon.
Yeah.
I wanted to photograph him with dignity. I wanted to treat him as a serious musician, not as some fly-by-night pop star.
Or a carnival act.
Yes, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to treat him very seriously. And at that point in time, I thought that meant black and white. That seemed like the way to do it. So I didn't shoot any color. It's so unprofessional of me. No. It's embarrassing, but I didn't. That's that. And when Chaz, the session was lovely. I mean, he was charming to be with. He was very responsive. He took my direction, which was very simplistic, but he took it. But the most important thing of all was that he communicated with the camera. He let me in. He let the camera capture something inner of him. Soul, heart, whatever you want to call it, spirit. He gave that to my camera, which is just absolutely fantastic.
Well, I think these photos, because we'll be showing them as we're speaking here, to me, you have to keep in mind that he's not famous at the time.
That's right.
But the photos show incredible confidence. I'm here and I'm about to take over. You really get that from those photos. He's so cocky in those photos. Such swagger.
Yes.
It's unbelievable.
Yes, it is. And he looked absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
His taste in clothes, the fashion of the day, this sort of second-hand, antique, velvet, Victorian, Edwardian, wonderful cuffs, beautiful fabrics, androgynous look. Yeah. It was like a duck to water. I mean, it just worked on him in a way that it never worked as well on an awful lot of people.
Right.
He was great. But also, if you look at his hair, it's unkempt, it's wild, it's ungroomed. Yeah. He has this sort of fantastic wildness to
animal
him.
Magnetism.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The amazing thing is, and we shot, laughingly, we would call it a whole day's shoot. It was 12 until 4 probably,
Right.
because then he had to go off to a gig on the South
Right.
Coast or something. But nevertheless, we were together quite a long time, and there's some really great pictures, not just the very famous Hands on the Hip picture, but lots and lots of others. And very sensitive, very smiling, a lot of smiling, particularly because Mitch, you know, in those days, everybody wanted to be mean, moody, and sexy.
Right.
That was
Pete
the
Best.
look. Yeah, absolutely.
Mean, moody, and magnificent.
Yes. But actually, Jimmy was very smiley.
Yeah, right.
And Mitch was so sweet and young. Whenever he tried to look mean, moody, and sexy, everybody else just broke up.
Right.
So there are a lot of pictures where Jimmy's just breaking up.
Right.
But they didn't get seen because everybody wanted to promote this sort of mean
Right.
image. And the funny thing is that within weeks, the guys, Mitch and Noel, had permed their hair to look more like Jimmy. And so I had
Not to mention Clapton.
Yes, absolutely. So I had to shoot another session with the band. I got a call from Chaz saying, we got to shoot the band. I said, what's wrong? What am I doing? He said, no, nothing wrong. They've just permed their hair. All the pictures you did with the band are out of date. All the Jimmy pictures are great. But the stuff. So I reshot just with the band. I didn't do any more solos with Jimmy, just the three of them. And we did another session. And do you know, Jimmy, although his hair was completely natural, but he'd already started to change. It wasn't as wild. He'd started to groom and get an afro shape rather than this.
Right. Method to the madness. Yeah.
And even his clothes had begun to take on a slightly more chosen, slightly more stylized look to them. And honestly, looking back, I don't think he ever again looked quite as good as he did in those early pictures.
Well, I think it's important to note that in those days there were no stylists.
None at all.
When you shot Jimi Hendrix, there wasn't a stylist that came to his place and tried on different outfits ahead of time or were in your studio. He came the way he came.
Yeah.
And so these guys had that artistic eye to pick out this. You look. I mean, people keep. I mean, I think about Steven Tyler, people like that are trying to emulate even 50, 60 years later what Hendrix was doing then in clothing.
Yes.
Not even getting into the music.
Yes.
Just the look.
Yeah.
Brian Jones was like that as well.
Absolutely.
And they just could put things together. They had this artistic eye that was quite amazing. And when you look at these things, and it really defined a style of what became what was thought of as a kind of that psychedelic dress.
Absolutely. And you know what's quite interesting? The first stylists were the girlfriends.
Yeah.
And especially during this androgynous mid-60s period, when a lot of girls' clothes were being used.
Well, scarves.
Well, scarves for a start, and the different fabrics and tight little shirts, which were definitely not designed for men.
Right. And the pants. And the tight pants.
And the very tight pants.
They were wearing women's jeans.
Absolutely. And high heels.
Yeah.
And big floppy hats.
Yeah.
So, you know, Marianne Faithfull at this point, Anita Pallenberg, and the Stones were sort of interchangeable almost. And so I think it was the girlfriends who were beginning to style.
Right.
They were the ones that were picking up, finally, try this on, throw this. What about this feather boa? You know,
Yeah.
And that, to be honest with you, I think that's when the looks began to go slightly downhill.
Yeah.
Because it became dressing up.
Yeah.
I don't see Jimmy dressing up. I just see him embracing this.
Whatever caught his eye.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was great. So next, there's so much to talk about here. We go forever.
Yeah.
We'll talk anyway.
Yeah.
The Yardbirds. I'm just interested.
Oh, okay. Well, the Yardbirds were a notorious, very famous band, partly because they had Clapton in them.
Right.
But they were a great band. I mean, they really, truly were. Keith Relf was a fantastic singer. They were all great musicians. And Eric left, and in came Jeff Beck. So they had Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page, two of Britain's leading guitarists. I'd known Jimmy.
Iconic to this day.
Absolutely. I'd known Jimmy for a little while because he was a session player, and he was on a lot of immediate record stuff. And I'd photographed him as a young session guy. We were acquainted. I wouldn't say we were bosom buddies, but we were acquainted. And I did a photograph of them. In those days, I used to shoot in my studio and then in the immediate area around the studio,
Right.
which meant Mason's Yard, or the other side of the studio was this sort of alley called Ormond Yard. And I photographed where I photographed the Stones at the building site, and
Yeah.
for Caged and for other pictures, including the record cover. That was all in Ormond Yard. And I photographed the Yardbirds in the classic arrowhead formation, legs apart, with Jimi and Jeff together on the right-hand side. Jimi in this fantastic double-breasted,
Right.
sort of almost military naval jacket.
Which John Varvatos has brought back.
Yes, John Von and Jimi still has the same jacket.
Yeah.
And I got this extraordinary set of pictures of them, which is actually a much bigger set than it's thought about, because this particular picture caught a moment when a man in a bowler hat, a businessman walking down, is caught between Keith Relf's legs. I just caught him. I saw him out of the corner of my eye, snapped, and got him as
Right.
he's, and it just embodies something
Right.
about these young men.
Taking over.
Yeah.
So was this at the time, because that lineup is pretty much what's in Blow Up too.
It was. So this must be, I guess, 66.
Yeah.
Because I don't think Jeff was in the band for more than 6 weeks. 6 months, I beg your pardon. 6 months,
right.
yeah.
Quite an extraordinary time. Were you involved in Blow Up at all?
No, not at all. I didn't like it.
Yeah.
I hated it.
So much to talk about, but time-wise, wrapping up a bit,
Okay.
I would like to talk a bit about the Eurythmics and Oasis.
Okay,
Your work
good.
with them.
Oh, well, that'll be fun. Well, Eurythmics have a special place for me. I met them when they were in The Tourists, when Dave and Annie were in The Tourists.
Yeah.
Fantastic band. I did a very, very strange album cover for them called Reality Effects, which was a great thing. It was a white, the idea was that they were all dressed in white, in a white room with white furniture, that I would give them non-toxic kids paints, and they would like paint the room in a painting with numbers style. And we would build up. What I didn't know was that 2 of the band had just taken acid and it kicked in just as we were about to shoot. And I said, like, okay, start painting. And they just threw. And there was a paint fight.
Right.
And it was amazing and far better than the original concept.
Wow.
But it was out of control.
Right.
And the whole set just looked like a Jackson Pollock.
Right.
And they're completely covered with paint. And there's a shot, a wonderful, there's a great portrait of Annie. She was wearing a bride's outfit. She's just covered in paint. And
Which
then,
incident was in the V&A exhibition.
yes, it was in the V&A exhibition. And I became friends with them. I did another series of portraits of the Tourists. Then they left the Tourists to form the Eurythmics. And they couldn't, actually, they struggled to get a record deal. And RCA would only do a single by single deal. So they had to present a whole package to RCA and hope that RCA would buy it.
Right.
So they were financing everything, and they asked me and another photographer who they'd worked with to contribute our images on the basis that should they get a deal, we would get paid.
Right.
And I did one of the singles like that. Then I did another session, and then they did a session for me. And it was great. And I loved working with them. I loved, Annie is not just incredibly beautiful, but she just responds to the camera.
Yeah.
She's magnificent. And Dave has a fantastic look, and the combination of the 2 of them is great. So I worked with them on 3 or 4 sessions, and the last session I did was for an album that was going to be called Revenge. And I went to Paris to shoot them, and things would change between them. There was a lot of tension, and it was a difficult session. And I shot what I thought, amongst other things, was this really beautiful portrait of them. Super simple, but very powerful. She's just apparently naked, bare shoulders. He's just wearing a black jacket. It was a lovely portrait. And as I left, and I'd said to Dave, I really like this portrait. And he said, yeah, no, I really like it. I'm going to get this friend of mine to paint a picture based on it.
Yeah.
I was so upset.
Right.
I was so distressed. And because there was this horrible painting
Yeah.
that's based on my photograph, and the
right.
photograph is so much better.
Yeah.
So that was always a big disappointment. But nevertheless, I took the picture, and the picture's an important one for me. And I you know, they were a wonderful band, and I still in contact with both of them. Not close at all, but I'm still
Yeah.
touch base with them, and they were a great band to work with, and made just marvelous music. And then Oasis, I was asked to photograph Oasis in I think it was 94, really early, and I thought they were a tribute band. I mean, I really did. I thought they were. I didn't know what the fuss was about. I thought they were a Beatles Stones tribute band. So I said to Mojo magazine, an English magazine that wanted me to shoot them for the cover, I said, why don't I do a pastiche of Between the Buttons? Now, I thought that was quite funny,
Yeah.
but I also thought that it would work, you know.
Right.
That the subtlety of the Stones element would be lost on most contemporary
Right.
people, so it wouldn't be offensive, you know.
Right,
It wouldn't. I wasn't taking the piss out of it. I planned to do that. And I recreated the filter. It was a little more polished. It was a little more refined. But the band were horrible. I mean, they were so unpleasant.
Yeah. With each other, too.
With each other and with me and with the studio. It was just awful. And after an hour, I said to their tour manager, I said, you know, I knew him. I said, Robbie, this isn't going to happen. You know, can you talk to them? You know. And he talked to them in the kitchen of the studio, and I heard him saying, look, you know, you're either going to do this session, it's the cover of Mojo, you need to be on the cover of Mojo, or else I'm just, you know, I'm going to take you out of here and we'll go. Right. And I heard Liam shout out, you know, it's just a fucking photo session. And but it's an important photo. Right. Okay, fine, we'll do it. And then we had a wonderful session.
Wow.
You know, and I'll never know to this day, because I've never met them since, I've never spoken to them since, I'll never know why they were so antagonistic towards me. Right. But the atmosphere was absolutely terrible, and then suddenly we did this great session. Fantastic. And the cover is a pastiche of the Between the Buttons, but it works beautifully.
Yeah. It's fantastic cover.
Yeah.
Just to finish up, I did want to talk just a little bit about your association with Christian Furr.
Yes, thank you.
Painter, you might mention a little bit of him in the Royal Photography.
Yeah.
Painting.
Well, Christian Furr has been a friend of mine for like 15 years. He rang me 15 years ago and said, I'd like to do a swap. I'd like to paint your portrait. I'd like you to photograph me. And that's what we did. And it was just a lovely thing to do. Right. We became firm friends ever since. And Christian is the youngest person ever to be commissioned to paint the Queen. And he did a most beautiful portrait of her. He's a very accomplished portrait artist and a lovely painter and a lovely man, and loves music and loves my photographs. And he said to me about 3 years ago, he said, why don't we do a collaboration? And I couldn't quite see how it worked. And I said, well, I don't want to give you prints of my work and just have you paint on them. I don't like that. You know, photographers have done that. Don't really like it. It's not really what I consider a collaboration. So he said, well, why don't we try and find a way of collaborating? And so we got our heads together, and I decided that this was something I really wanted to do. And I was stimulated by the idea. And we decided that what I would do was we chose a dozen or so images that I'd taken, historical images, Stones, Hendrix, Marianne, Kate Bush, and others, that I would create new versions of these images. I would make the prints myself at my studio in the country at home where I live, and that I would then incorporate in these new prints painterly elements that he and I discussed, and then I would send all the prints up to him in London, and he would add more paint and texture and gold leaf and diamond dust and crayon and all sorts of stuff. And suddenly you have these extraordinary images that really, when you look at them, you have no idea where I end and he begins. And in my feeling, it's a real collaboration. It's a real combination of our different skills. And I'm love it. People seem to love it, and it's an ongoing project. I
You're
hope to-
very successful in your exhibitions of that. Fantastic.
yeah, and I hope to bring it to America. I'm trying
Right.
to bring it to America.
Well, good. And just finally, just to talk a little bit about the Sky TV, you're here to curate, I call it, you're the host really,
Yeah.
of a 6-part series on rock photography.
Yes, it's called Icon, but that is the working title. I add because it could well evolve.
Right.
But it's a 6 one-hour episode series that looks at rock music, but seriously, all aspects of rock music. So from album sleeves to backstage to live to magazines to hanging in galleries in museums to Instagram to everything from Robert Johnson to rap and hip hop and everything else that's going on, grime and grunge and whatever else is happening. All aspects of it. We're trying to interview about 50 photographers and about 20 other voices to cover all of this. And it's going to be Sky Art, I hope, in England and something else here, which I don't know whether I should say, but it's fully funded and it's ready to go, and we're shooting interviews. That's why I'm here in your lovely home.
Lovely.
Because we're interviewing people this week in LA.
Well, great. Gered, thanks so much.
Thanks,
gosh,
John.
what a pleasure to see you. Thank
So
you so
lovely
much.
to see you.
And thank you. And thank you. We'll see you next time on the Malibu Music Room.